Hello lovelies. This might get a bit stream of consciousness because I didn't really prepare much for today. One of my regular stream players, a bit more private than I am about their lives, blogs about interesting RPG and medieval related miscellanea over at the Motley Fool, motleyfool.substack.com if you're interested. He's extremely well versed in these topics and writes with a slightly dry but very informative style that I appreciate. Now, I'm known, I think, in part for my generally lukewarm takes that happen too late after the controversy has happened to get any clicks. But he put out a blog today, or perhaps yesterday, addressing the somewhat stale topic of the mythic versus the naturalistic dungeon in fantasy worlds, in fantasy games, in fantasy writing, I suppose. Like me, he is by instinct and real-world proclivity a naturalist, that is, a materialist in the non-Madonna sense, who is open to the possibility of the supernatural, but doesn't believe in it yet, and has a pretty high threshold for evidence. But games don't need to follow our real-world proclivities. Sometimes it's hard to see past how we feel about the real world, and a degree of realism, or at least hyperrealism, is often necessary for immersion into a fantasy. That is, a world, however fantastical, must make sense, at the very least, within itself, in order for us to lose ourselves in the narrative. Things that break that take us out of our character and out of the narrative, take us out of the moment, and break that thing that is very hard to sustain in games where we are genuinely making decisions as our characters, doing things as our characters, experiencing things as our characters. It's a delicate thing to hold on to. Now, this also takes us into other things that I've talked about recently, or not so recently, the but my dragons argument and why it doesn't work, in that because there is a supernatural rule-breaking thing in one corner of a world doesn't mean that anything goes, right? And it should be fairly obvious that it doesn't. Or the other way, the Thermian argument, saying that because this is the nature of the world isn't a good enough reason for something. I reject both of these lines of attack. But there is something there, and those ridiculous over-applications help highlight it, I think. The mythical and the naturalistic do exist at something of a tension, but the two sides have extremes that refuse to allow for any overlap. Just like in the real world, some people assign everything to some grand conspiracy, or the inscrutable designs of a personal god, or Jewish space lasers, or whatever else it might be. Some take a more mechanistic clockwork universe point of view. Most people are somewhere in the middle, and even avowed atheistic materialists like myself have had inexplicable experiences. We just refuse to assign them to anything when we don't know, hence inexplicable, but only temporarily inexplicable in most cases. To take either extreme, particularly when we're addressing a fantasy world or a mutual consensual fantasy, is to ignore all the places in story and myth where the two things overlap, and they overlap a lot. Typically, you will find in stories that someone crosses over some sort of threshold from the prosaic to the wondrous. A wall, a gate, a door, a pool, a fairy ring, a heroic dose of DMT. They then return with something from that mythical other realm to the prosaic world with their experience, their swan bride, their great riches, their insights into machine elves, or great cunning that they have developed while they were over there. We can also see prosaic things invested with supernatural power. Iron, for example, or horseshoes, which are said to contain luck, or to shield you from bad luck, depending which way up you hang it and whereabouts in the country you are. So the contrast and the conflict between that mundanity and the fantastic are often where the story is. As I tire of repeating, conflict is where interesting stories live, like flavour with fat in meat. If you can balance at a sort of Lagrange point between the two extremes, you can also create a sort of literary or verbal uncanny valley that flutters at the edges of taking you out of the story and creating a sense of disconnection, disembodiment, in a way that is quite effective from a storytelling point of view. Lovecraft, at his best, achieves this through his archaic and arcane, self-contradicting descriptions of things beyond human ken. The Green Knight, the film, which my friend uses as one of his key examples, also surfs that line with strangeness, contrasting with mundanity. Even Monty Python and the Holy Grail does it, via its absurdity, transplanting elements of the modern, such as a discussion of obscure left-wing student politics, into Arthurian legend, or my preference, the slight that it might be, would be for Gilliam's Jabberwocky, where the power of guild capitalism intersects with the very material depredations of a ludicrous beast. There's no reason why, in our worlds, our games, our stories, the mundane and the mythical can't coexist and even occupy the same landscape. And the sense that the first makes can build up a sort of credit for the second. You carry people along with you with realism before you introduce something unreal, and you've built up a certain degree of trust that things are still going to make some sort of sense somehow, somewhere. Some beasts, some monsters, some dungeons are purely materialistic. The ruined tower that serves as a den for a family of owlbears has no particular need for a layer of fancy and whimsy over the top of it. An ancient shrine, perhaps at its deepest spiralling tunneled level, however, might contain a pool or a holy well that leads you into an underworld filled with the spirits of the dead, which it occasionally vomits forth in the form of drache or wights to plague the local lands. Purely supernatural beings need no special particular material explanation because they are made of magic. Zombies, skeletons, ghosts, fairies, these don't especially need any sort of ecology or grounding, just an excuse. Some things bridge the gap between the two, however. They don't especially make sense necessarily, but they have to fit into the fantasy ecology somehow. Mimics, dragons, and other strange creatures, and apex intelligent predators feel like they need some sort of material explanation because they have some sort of material influence on the world around them. But magic plays its role here as well, and while in some instances a wizard did it is a cop-out, by no means is that always the case. Humans are story-making machines, myth-making machines. Even when we forget the origins of something, vestiges of it remain in myth and in our linguistic, noospheric landscape, if you will, same as they do in the physical landscape. English in particular is littered with the partially digested corpses of other languages and meanings, and it's the same for our mythology, which remains a gloriously syncretic hodgepodge of paganism with a thin veneer of Christianity smeared on top, much like someone cautiously trying Marmite for the first time. Sometimes the two converge. There's a pub on the way to Reading, where I have my meat space games. So on the way there from my abode, there is this pub called The Cunning Man, which forms a beautiful nexus of all of the kind of things that I'm meandering about in this video. The pub itself has been rebuilt and added to over the centuries, and it's now a half-thatch, half-tiled construction. The site has been notable as a ford since the 13th century, with the older part of the pub probably being established in the 16th century, when we were still hanging witches. It's a Franken pub, a boozer of Theseus, if you will. Now, if I say cunning to you, it implies skill and deceit, but it used to mean something more mythical and magical. A cunning man or woman was a sort of witch or wizard, someone who would help with curses, spells, and other magical goings-on. You can sort of see how the meaning mutated, and you can see similar crossover in the concept of crafty and the craft. And here it is, as the name of a pub, commemorating a half-remembered story of some fancy local-ish wizard. The village of Torpenhow has become somewhat famous online because of its name, which means hill, hill, hill in 3 different languages. But even more fascinatingly, there is no Torpenhow Hill, like some people claim, so there's no hill, 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 hill. Just that. Hill in so many different languages becoming a new word, a portmanteau word. There are even real-world examples of Pratchett's comedic example of explorers naming things "a mountain, you fool," in the local dialect, because that's what a native said when the explorer pointed and asked. And I love shit like this, these intersections of the magical, the humorous, the mundane, which occur all over Britain. The jumble of languages, different mythologies and history, the higgledy-piggledy of one thing on top of the other, that you just don't seem to get anywhere else, at least not to this same extent. I don't think that a Lewis, Tolkien, a Pratchett or a Moore could have happened anywhere else. And while he's out of favour, I think the same goes for Neil Gaiman. Earlier, I described my learned friend as being well-versed, and that's another linguistic corpse. Versed comes from an archaic verb, to verse, meaning to turn. To be well-versed, then, was to be someone who had turned an idea or a thought over in their mind many times, to have spent time in contemplation, or to have read many books by versing the pages. And that's a little nugget, a little fact that you'll probably remember now, because I've attached a story to it. And that's what this all really is, I think. The lies that have legs tend to stick around because they have a better story attached to them, and that's the thing that people remember. Like a mnemonic device you might learn in school. Richard of York gave battle in vain for the Spectrum, or my very efficient mother jumped sideways under Nana's potty for the planet. And this is the same for landscape and mythology and old stories. And that, for me, is where the mythic and the prosaic meet, where something memorable happens and becomes legend, then fades and twists through language and time. We do this in our mundane lives, all the time. I sometimes eavesdrop on conversations, on the bus or the train, and I've often heard people giving directions that amount to something of the effect of, "Yeah, meet us near the little Tesco. No, the one that used to be the co-op. You know, where Rebecca threw up in her shoes. No, you know the one. Yeah, that one. Where Darren got glassed by that drunk bloke." It's beautiful in its way. I used to make up stories about the route I used to walk to take to art college so that I would remember the way, and the stories work just as well if they're untrue as if they're true. So then the issue for us, in our work, in our play, becomes more about signifying the crossover from the mundane into the fantastical, about signalling it to the players, even if subtly, to show them that they've crossed some sort of threshold from the mundane to the wondrous, so that you can maintain immersion as they cross from one set of rules, those of the physical parochial world, and into another set of rules, the contracts of demons, the weird psychology of the Fae, the grasping void of the dead, or whatever else. This is easier in other mediums than the ones we use, but it can be done simply. The wonderful UK serial of Robin of Sherwood also tied Robin to the pagan past of Britain, and he would regularly meet up for a chat with Herne the Hunter in the deep woods. The transition to the mythical was often done with simple things like low camera angles, backlighting, or a single heroic smoke machine somewhere in the forests of England. But it was enough of a signifier that the rules had changed, from fighting Guy of Gisborne to tangling with a sorcerer or performing duties for the horned god. You can do it with a description of a physical portal, informing the players of a feeling, a shift in atmosphere. Tell them when they cross the boundary that it feels like they're tipsy or dreaming, or that there's a strange pressure in their ears or just behind their eyes. Even a little goes a long way to signify this shift to the mythological. You can also provide hints through language and description, just as famous authors have done, and I mentioned some earlier. But it doesn't have to be a strenuous effort. You don't have to reach for the thesaurus. You just need to communicate that shift, however subtle. If you have LED lights in the room where you play, you can even just change those. Perhaps a warm yellow-white for the mythic and a stark blue-white for the real, or even stronger or stranger colours. My long and rambling point here is that the mythic and the mundane are in tension, but they don't have to be in opposition. Each can exist alongside the other, and each can benefit from the other, and you can benefit from addressing either side. You can learn a great deal about ecosystems and naturalism by trying to make things make physical sense, and you can learn a lot about history and mythology by delving into that side of things. You can also learn a lot by looking at the landscape around you, the history around you, the language around you. Perhaps less so if you're not an English speaker. You can draw inspiration for thresholds and crossings, holdovers, and places where the two touch, intersect, and cross over from all these things around you. So try overthinking a little bit. It's usually worth it, and the research is edifying, if nothing else. Zang.
Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
Neverwear is a book by Neil Gaiman and a TV series from 1996, which has also been produced as a radio play and as a graphic novel. I secured permission in 1997 from Crucial Films and Neil Gaiman's agent to produce a semi-official Neverwear role-playing game, provided that it not be done for profit. With the Neverwear RPG, you can follow in the footsteps of the Lady Door and Richard Mayhew Dick in exploring London's mysterious underside, the twilight world just out of sight of normal people. Beware of Knight's Bridge, avoid the Seven Sisters, be cautious of Turnham Green, and walk the byways of the floating market. Neverwear uses the description system, a bridge between descriptive prose and dice mechanics, to let you really bring your words to life. Available for free at drivethrurpg.com.